Welcome back to another episode of Voices That Matter with Enlinature. I'm your host, Tina Prina Khan, and today our theme would be From the Wild to the Familiar, understanding wildlife, endangered species, and their connection with the human activity. Wildlife is not disappearing silently, it's adapting, shifting, and giving us signals. To talk our on theme, I'm joined today by Kacie Hanke, who is a wildlife biologist working on conservation of large mammals in the urban environment. Welcome to Inline Nature, Kacie.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here.
Rising temperature all across the globe and expanding cities are reshaping the landscapes faster than the species are able to adapt. The natural migration routes that used to be there for centuries and centuries are now being altered or completely cut off. That is pushing the animals to take difficult decisions and choices in order to survive. So, my first question would be, how do you think that climate change and urban expansion affects the wildlife behavior and migration patterns?
Yeah, so for mule deer in particular, climate change kind of hits them on both sides. So in one way, our winters become less predictable, and they can become more severe in different areas. So mule deer have their hard time of year during the winter. It's harder to find food. It's hard to raise young, and that's why their breeding patterns are at specific times of year. And the way climate change impacts that is by potentially making it difficult for animals like mule deer to predict when the best time to reproduce and have young would be. And it also can make those winters more severe, make it harder for them to survive through an already difficult winter. If they're having trouble finding forage, if they're having trouble knowing when to migrate and when to optimize forage patterns in other areas along their migration routes, that can make something that's already hard on them even harder. On the other side, in the other seasons, it can really intensify drought, which leads to increased wildfire and increased wildfire intensity. So wildfire is actually generally good for mule deer when it's low intensity and it creates what we call like a mosaic across the landscape. So if you have low intensity burns, it can change the habitat, increase biodiversity of plant life, and that can help out mule deer. They have different options for nutrition, they have different options for cover and shelter, and they have different options for escape route from predators. If you have these increases in wildfire and you're decimating landscapes, mule deer won't select for that habitat. So that basically means they've just lost any habitat in that area. And it might lead to them not selecting it over time. So there might be a small period afterwards when there's like fresh regrowth and there's some cover that they might select for it. But if, increased wildfire leads to sort of feedback loops with invasive species that then get to overgrown over, a couple decades, let's say, then they might not be able to select for that area because it's just too thick for them. And so, with all these like big ideas around climate change, when you add urbanization on top of that, it can like really mess things up. So it's kind of easy to imagine that if you have busy highways, roadways, and fences, that's going to block these migration pathways. If you're trying to migrate miles and optimize your forage, maybe you're having to choose different routes to, get around these barriers, but that might not be the most optional way for you to optimize your forage along the way. The other thing is that all these roadways can increase vehicle collisions with deer. And if they're just getting barricaded by, vehicle collisions, that obviously has a negative impact on their survival rates. But even animals that are just trying to disperse, so like species more broadly, it can make it hard for them to disperse from their parental ranges and go establish their own home range. So where I work in sort of the greater Los Angeles area, mountains are a big example of this. A lot of people don't even realize that we have mountain lions here, considering it's a huge megacity, but we do have mountain lions in our mountains, and these huge highways and freeways can be a significant barrier. And if they're not able to cross these highways, establish new home ranges, find new mates, that'll affect their genetic diversity, their genetic flow, and then that can lead to local population extinction. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, all of these things can kind of like add up and impact our entire ecosystems in ways that we might not even be thinking about
Yeah.
too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You are working on conservation of mule as you just mentioned, but most of the time when we are talking about conservation, these conservation efforts are limited to individual species. But if you want to have an effective solution, you have to understand the ecosystem on a broader spectrum, obviously. But studying one species does give us a kind of pattern that we can apply on other species that are sharing the same environment. So, what does studying mule deer reveals about conserving other animals that are living in the similar ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it kind of brings up this point that, like, especially when we want to help large mammals, that requires big solutions and really
Mm-hmm.
complex solutions. Like when they're dealing with multiple problems, we need to have solutions that, address multiple problems. And what I think is really interesting about mule deer in particular is that they're often used as a sort of case study for where indigenous knowledge and stewardship can really help, you know, fulfill these complex solutions that we need. Um, for example, like there are mule deer up in Canada, and a case study came out where they sort of looked at like the regulations that are in place right now versus
Mm-hmm.
the recommendations based on the scientific literature, Western science, but recommendations nonetheless, the gaps between those, and then where Indigenous stewardship and knowledge can actually fill those gaps. And, um, I think it's really easy to become sort of overwhelmed by like all of these complex problems. And of course, it's overwhelming because our regulations, at least in the United States, tend to be focused on singular solutions. We tend to only focus on forestry first or wildfire first or like one thing at a time. And what Indigenous knowledge and stewardship could, teach us and show us is that these require tackling it from multiple places and also just like reimagining our relationship with these species and what that really needs to look like for us. So, like mule deer in particular are a species that, they're a conservation success story historically. They were going to go extinct in the 1800s in North America because we were overhunting them. We weren't managing for ecosystem balance. And so they were like way down in numbers. And because of hunting management and regulation, they have rebounded in numbers. But that being said, they still have a lot of threats that if we keep going on these pathways, that could reduce them again. And I guess all of that is to say that like our relationship with animals is really going to be the thing that helps us sort of decide to take those next steps and like meet those complex solutions and understanding what conflict looks like, but like really what coexistence looks like and needs to look like when we're encountering species more as we conserve them and as we take care of them and as we balance the ecosystem is really, in my opinion, going to be key to helping out all
Mm-hmm.
species, whether it's predators or deer or smaller animals. So yeah, kind of two big and intimidating ideas, and they're kind of coming from like a system down idea, but it really is going to be based on like community engagement, listening to Indigenous stewards, and using that to kind of rethink our relationship with animals. And that applies, in my opinion, to all species, whether they're endangered or not.
True, true, true. When we talk about endangered species, the first thing that comes into our mind is habitat loss. But obviously, the reality is far more complex than that. Animals and species, they are facing multiple overlapping pressures that are pushing them closer to extinction. So, what do you think beyond this habitat loss? What are the other factors that can potentially lead a species towards endangerment?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors. So for deer and ungulates in general, disease can play a huge factor. If you
Mhm.
live in North America, you might have heard of chronic wasting disease, and that is a disease that is decimating our mule deer populations in particular, local populations, I should say. But that came from probably a domestic livestock species. And so diseases from domestic animals and from people can play a huge part in species
Mhm.
endangerment. Surprisingly, poaching and black market trade for plants and animals play a huge role, including in the United States. We do see a lot of poaching happening. And I think there's oftentimes specific things for each species. So, for example, like California condors, they really struggle because of lead poisoning from ammunition, of all things. To me, that's why scientific research and funding for science is so important, because there might be things that we're not
Mhm.
thinking of broadly for all species that could be impacting species, and it might be like a very niche issue. Still kind of going on condors too, though, it's, like microplastics in the environment and trash in the environment plays a big role in deaths for young chicks. And so it really is a lot of widespread issues. And again, I think that's why it's important for us to think about all of it from like, what is our relationship to the environment? What are we putting out there when we're consuming things? What are we releasing into the environment when we pour something down the drain? Um,
Mhm.
and stuff like that.
Yeah, true, true. I totally agree with that. Now we'll move again towards the mule deers. These mule deers, these are the kind of species who that are continuing to exist alongside human development. You watch them on the roadsides, on the farmland, and even on the urban edges. When you look at these mule deers, the first thing that comes to your mind is, oh, are these species actually thriving, or are they just coping merely? So my question would be, are these a symbol of resilience, mule deers, or are they just a warning sign?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's actually both. One example with mule deer in particular is that as climate change increases, we have a warmer climate down here. We'll also probably have a warmer climate in the northern regions. And that could lead to a range expansion for mule deer. If winters are less severe in areas of the Arctic Circle, they might be able to expand northward, and that would be good for them. They also, as you pointed out, they really love agriculture land. Like the ways that we use land for agriculture can be good or can be negative. Same thing with logging. If we log, for timber in a certain way, it can be good for them because it will create a mosaic landscape, like we talked about earlier, and that can benefit them in terms of nutrition and cover. On the flip side, there's almost always a negative consequence to these things. So if mule deer are expanding north, they're going to be competing with caribou, and caribou are an endangered species. Um, if they are experiencing this climate change on the southern end of their range, they're probably going to lose habitat as it gets warmer and wildfires increase. If you overlog, then that can be negative for mule deer, and they won't be able to use that habitat as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, in some ways, they are very resilient, and they have made it this far. And in some ways, if we keep going on a trajectory of just extracting from our environment nonstop, that can also be negative. And so, what I think it really speaks to with mule deer in particular, but also species broadly, is that our interactions with the environment don't have to be separate. So, like, humans should not be separate from the environment, but the way that we interact with our environment is incredibly important. And to kind of go back to Indigenous stewardship and knowledge, like, that is what Indigenous knowledge teaches us, is that the ways in which we interact with our environment is really going to be what's key to either conserving species and working with their resilience, or ignoring the warning signs and letting them go extinct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So, listening to these stories from the natural world, we move beyond awareness, we move toward responsibility. And the future of wildlife does not depend entirely on the protected areas, but as you mentioned, it also depends on our relationship with the wildlife, how we design our cities, how we design our policies. Thank you so much, Kacie, for joining us today. And I will be back with another episode of Voices That Matter. Till then, stay connected with your planet.